I'm back from Tango and I am pretty much bottom of the class. I think there was a glimmer of hope there, of just starting to feel it. Anyway, I guess this is the 7th or it should be 8th video or something like that. Aldous Huxley's Island. We're in the middle of chapter 4. The hand touched him again. "I'm Susilla MacPhail," said the voice. "Mary Sorrigini's mother." Reluctantly, Will turned his head and opened his eyes. An adult, darker version of Mary Sorrigini was sitting there beside the bed, smiling at him with friendly solicitude. To smile back at her would have cost him too great an effort. He contented himself with saying, "How do you do?" then pulled the sheet a little higher and closed his eyes again. Susilla looked down at him in silence, at the bony shoulders, at the cage of ribs under a skin whose Nordic pallor made him seem, to her Palanese eyes, so strangely frail and vulnerable, at the sunburnt face, emphatically featured like a carving intended to be seen at a distance, emphatic and yet sensitive, the quivering, more than naked face. She found herself thinking of a man who had been flayed and left to suffer. "I hear you're from England," she said at last. "I don't care where I'm from," Will muttered irritably, "nor where I'm going. From hell to hell." "I was in England just after the war," she went on, "as a student." He tried not to listen, but ears have no lids. There was no escape from that intruding voice. "There was a girl in my psychology class," it was saying. "Her people lived at Wells. She asked me to stay with them for the first month of the summer vacation. Do you know Wells?" Of course he knew Wells. Why did she pester him with her silly reminiscences? "I used to love walking there by the water," Susilla went on, looking across the moat at the cathedral and thinking, while she looked at the cathedral, of Dugald under the palm trees on the beach, of Dugald giving her her first lesson in rock climbing. "You're on the rope, you're perfectly safe, you can't possibly fall." "Can't possibly fall," she repeated bitterly, and then remembered here and now, remembered that she had a job to do, remembered, as she looked again at the flayed, emphatic face, that here was a human being in pain. "How lovely it was," she went on, "and how marvellously peaceful." The voice, it seemed to Will Farnaby, had become more musical and in some strange way more remote. Perhaps that's why he no longer resented its intrusion. Such an extraordinary sense of peace. Shanti, shanti, shanti. The peace that passes understanding. The voice was almost chanting now. Chanting, it seemed, out of some other world. "I can shut my eyes," it chanted on, "can shut my eyes and see it all so clearly, can see the church, and it's enormous, much taller than the huge trees round the bishop's palace. Can see the green grass and the water and the golden sunlight on the stones and the slanting shadows between the buttresses. And listen, I can hear the bells and the jackdaws in the tower. Can you hear the jackdaws?" Yes, he could hear the jackdaws, could hear them almost as clearly as he now heard those parrots in the trees outside his window. He was here, and at the same time he was there. Here in this dark, sweltering room near the equator, but also there, outdoors, in that cool hollow at the edge of the Mendips, with the jackdaws calling from the cathedral tower and the sound of the bells dying away into the green silence. "And there are white clouds," the voice was saying, "and the blue sky between them is so pale, so delicate, so exquisitely tender." "Tender," he repeated. The tender blue sky of that April weekend he had spent there, before the disaster of their marriage with Molly. There were daisies in the grass and dandelions, and across the water towered up the huge church, challenging the wildness of those soft April clouds with its austere geometry, challenging the wildness and at the same time complementing it, coming to terms with it in perfect reconciliation. That was how it should have been with himself and Molly. how it had been then. And the swans, he now heard the voice dreamily chanting. The swans. Yes, the swans. White swans moving across a mirror of jade and jet, a breathing mirror that heaved and trembled, so that their silvery images were forever breaking and coming together again, disintegrating and being made whole. Like the inventions of heraldry, romantic, impossibly beautiful. And yet there they are, real birds in a real place, so near to me now that I can almost touch them, and yet so far away, thousands of miles away, far away on that smooth water, moving as if by magic, softly, majestically, moving majestically, with the dark water lifting and parting as the curved white breasts advanced, lifting, parting, sliding back in ripples that widened in a gleaming arrowhead behind them. He could see them moving across their dark mirror, could hear the jackdaws in the tower, could catch through this nearer mingling of disinfectants and gardenias the cold, flat, weedy smell of that Gothic moat in the faraway green valley. Effortlessly floating, Will said to himself. Effortlessly floating. Effortlessly floating. The words gave him a deep satisfaction. I'd sit there, she was saying. I'd sit there looking and looking, and in a little I'd be floating too. I'd be floating with the swans on that smooth surface between the darkness below and the pale tender sky above. Floating at the same time on that other surface between here and far away, between then and now. And between remembered happiness, she was thinking, and this insistent, excruciating presence of an absence. Floating, she said aloud, on the surface between the real and the imagined, between what comes to us from the outside and what comes to us from within, from deep, deep down in here. She laid her hand on his forehead, and suddenly the words transformed themselves into the things and events for which they stood. The images turned into facts. He actually was floating. Floating, the voice softly insisted. Floating like a white bird on the water. Floating on a great river of life. A great, smooth, silent river that flows so still you might almost think it was asleep. A sleeping river, but it flows irresistibly. Life flowing silently and irresistibly into ever fuller life, into a living peace all the more profound, all the richer and stronger and more complete because it knows all your pain and unhappiness, knows them and takes them into itself, and makes them one with its own substance. And it's into that peace that you're floating now, floating on this smooth, silent river that sleeps and is yet irresistible, and is irresistible precisely because it's sleeping, and I'm floating with it. She was speaking for the stranger. She was speaking on another level for herself. Effortlessly floating. Not having to do anything at all. Just letting go. Just allowing myself to be carried along. Just asking this irresistible sleeping river of life to take me where it's going. And knowing all the time that where it's going is where I want to go. Where I have to go. Into more life. Into living peace. Along the sleeping river, irresistibly into the wholeness of reconciliation. Involuntarily, unconsciously, Will Farnaby gave a deep sigh. How silent the world had become. Silent with a deep crystalline silence, even though the parrots were still busy out there beyond the shutters, even though the voice still chanted here beside him. Silence and emptiness, and through the silence and emptiness flowed the river, sleeping and irresistible. Susilla looked down at the face on the pillow. It seemed suddenly very young, childlike in its perfect serenity. The frowning lines across the forehead had disappeared. The lips that had been so tightly closed in pain were parted now, and the breath came slowly, softly, almost imperceptibly. She remembered suddenly the words that had come into her mind as she looked down, one moonlit night, at the transfigured innocence of Dugald's face. She giveth her beloved sleep. Sleep, she said aloud. Sleep. The silence seemed to become more absolute, the emptiness more enormous. Asleep on the sleeping river, the voice was saying. And above the river, in the pale sky, there are huge white clouds. And as you look at them, you begin to float upwards towards them. Yes, you begin to float up towards them, and the river now is a river in the air, an invisible river that carries you on, carries you up higher and higher. Upwards, upwards through the silent emptiness. The image was the thing, the words became the experience. Out of the hot plain, the voice went on, effortlessly, into the freshness of the mountains. Yes, there was the Jungfrau, dazzlingly white against the blue. There was Monte Rosa. How fresh the air feels as you breathe it, fresh, pure, charged with life. He breathed deeply and the new life flowed into him, and now a little wind came blowing across the snowfields, cool against his skin, deliciously cool, and, as though echoing his thoughts, as though describing his experience, the voice said, coolness, coolness and sleep, through coolness into more life, through sleep into reconciliation, into wholeness, into living peace. Half an hour later, Susilla re-entered the sitting room. Well? Her father-in-law questioned. Any success? She nodded. I talked to him about a place in England, she said. He went off more quickly than I had expected. After that, I gave him some suggestions about his temperature. And the knee, I hope. Of course. Direct suggestion? No, indirect. They're always better. I got him to be conscious of his body image. Then I made him imagine it much bigger than in everyday reality, and the knee much smaller. A miserable little thing in revolt against a huge and splendid thing. There can't be any doubt as to who's going to win. She looked at the clock on the wall. Goodness, I must hurry, otherwise I'll be late for my class at school.